Living out in the country has its own unique mysteries alongside the beauty of it. Whether it is the symphony of croaks from the frogs at the pond or my neighbors, the howling of coyotes both near and far away, or even just the mooing of cows over at the next lot of land, there is also the fear that something might be waiting for you in a place without light pollution. Last summer, countless nights and evenings were spent in tree stands trying to take out a wild boar on the land, or even more recently using a hoe and shotgun to take out 2 copperhead snakes while a third one was burned in our burn pit. So when I walk the dog at night, I have a small .38 revolver with me. It won't do much, heaven forbid, if I ran into something large, but it provides a sense of comfort and security against the unknown. Even with an adjustable, night vision-friendly green flashlight, you're left with that, your senses, the dog's as well, and the light of the moon bearing down on you if it's showing, all for you to make sense of the deep and dense darkness in wood as you walk through and penetrate it with your flashlight. Each step along the path that you know with such familiarity in the daytime with no real concern, until the sudden and continuous sense of movement, only detectable by ear as you turn to see what exactly was happening in those dimly lit trees and underbrush. If you hunt, you get used to it. The fear isn't something you're worried about, but even for me, the back of my mind has that lingering sense of just what unknowns are out there when I walk at night, both in the corporeal sense of the fauna, but as well as the spiritual. Recently, on the subject of the deep and dark woods, I came across this meme talking about the differences between American and European forests. One I find oddly applicable to the history and psyche between these two peoples. While obviously it's a meme and not at all representative, each meme we tend to post or share on Twitter and Telegram has some kernel of truth in it for us to have the value that it does. The GIF goes something like this. On one side, you would have the European forest, showing its folklore and its mythos, featuring what we would associate with medieval high fantasy. Gnomes, elves, toadstools, frog-like beings, you name it. Its counterpart being that of the American forest, something of which is filled with the dark and maddening features of eldritch horror. The reason why I find this meme so enticing to discuss, or even examine, is how, when it first came my way, it was nothing more than something just humorous. That thing that you would grin at or huff some air out of your nostrils like you do when you're scrolling on your phone. Yet, at the second, then third glance of letting the GIF play out the way that it did, it made me think of just how vastly different our ideas of the forests are between the old and new world. Having grown up overseas due to my father's military career, I had the great privilege as a child and as a young man to see the various forests of Western Europe. Forests of military campaigns, whether it was imperial powers, the Holy Roman Empire, or even the Roman Empire. Forests across France and Germany still warn you about live ordnance from the Great War, or historical markers about the battlefields of the Romans fighting in Gaul. The scars run very deep, whether from artillery or the great empires of old buried beneath the roots of these forests. There's a sense of grand history, an example to behold of a heritage and identity crafted in years of conflict, empire, and geopolitics of both republic and monarchy. It does certainly remind me of the old adage I heard plenty of times growing up, that to an American, 100 years may seem like a long time, but to a European, 100 miles seems like forever. Which, of course, the meme reflects what I think about the differences of our respective folklores and peoples beyond the walled and lit knowns of our cities, farms, and suburbs. By the time of European colonization of the Americas, Europe had become a well-known and mapped land, not just in its geography, but demography, topography, and to some extent its historiography as well. For those who had settled here and built civilization out of those forests, the unknown was a very real fear and concern for them. Not just the natural unknowns like its geography or landmarks, but the wildlife, weather, and of course, the natives. Those fears and unknowns were likely only to be taken as the very signs and proofs of the evil one, something which helped provide the much-needed order and motivation to conquer and settle, to both the mainly Protestant population that came to settle in North America, but as well as the Catholics to the south, long after the Dutch and French were rooted out by English dominance. For America, the unknowns now take on American-sized proportions. Just as the land is vast, so is what scares us. I think that it had a certain impact on Lovecraft, and shows just as now how that meme does in comparison. Americans, while we do have a vast wealth of culture and history, we are still young to our European counterparts and forebears. However, there are certainly still similarities. A forest is still a forest. An American forest and a European forest are still large areas of land covered by a dense number of trees and foliage. Yet, people don't really live there, either as a commune or perhaps hermitage. There are other reasons, but I digress. Yet we have different forests in both America and Europe. Even specific European nations will have trees far different than perhaps those of neighboring states just a few dozen kilometers away. The redwood forest of California won't be comparable in its scope or scale of that of the Black Forest in Germany. And if you don't mind me stretching this short observation a little further, I think our understanding of our distinct political lenses can be viewed this way, at least when it comes to dealing with our struggles as dissidents at home. Of course, there are a few caveats, and I do hope to get to them in due time in this video. After all, this is one of those subjects that requires some serious thought, and while I certainly don't think that this video will offer a catch-all answer for the issue for both American and European dissidents, I do hope it sparks a conversation that leads to a productive and cohesive framework for strategizing as well as communicating. It's something I've been quite vocal about, the paying attention to the home and hearth rather than the siren call of the perpetually online, or the demoralizing exposure or outrage bait or fear porn. Especially as another generation begins to take stock of their problems, it is best to not have them swinging their axes down paths already made, or paths that lead to nowhere. Now, I can hear some degree already in the background of this conversation. We do work in a loose confederation model, where we tend to our own forests is already the working model. Which is the point here, and I think that it needs to be reaffirmed. We share distinct problems within our respective forests, and if we are to preserve them for our posterity, we should acknowledge some of our limitations of what we can accomplish in assistance to one another. Knowing one's place can go miles in offering aid, at least when it comes to the area of subject matter expertise. In engaging in strategic discussion, I know not to open my mouth on dealing with German speech codes or political rally discussions, save for merely reminding people to work within the letter of the law to avoid being arrested or the potential violence from the state. After all, democide is very real, and has been going on for some degree and for quite some time. I suppose what triggered this thought has been a few things. This argument for some kind of pan-Europeanism and Americanism argued by someone like Richard Spencer, coming out of this neo-functionalist umbrellas like the EU or NATO, and conversations I've heard between many on European and the American right, discussing what side is doing back home and how it could apply elsewhere, while seemingly talking past each other based upon nationality. As someone who offers commentary on international relations, geopolitics, and globalism in the modern world, I sometimes question the feasibility of these projects in the current time, at least as the institutions as they exist with their current political theology. For instance, NATO is currently unified in the name against Russia, but prior to the ongoing hostilities, you could see cracks underneath the alliance. Greece buying naval equipment and fighter aircraft from the French to have some kind of parity of force against the Turks in the Mediterranean, and of course over the issue of Cyprus, all while both nations being NATO members, so these agreements are explicitly bilateral. Even the more hawkish establishment types like George Friedman, whose own IR track record is abysmal, has made some salient points in his book Flashpoints, The Emerging Crisis in Europe, where he offers a pretty heady critique of the current Enlightenment project and the European Union, arguing that these projects cannot erase centuries, if not 1,000 years of history. Issues like the Franco-German rivalry, the split between the island and the continent, and the fundamental divides over Eastern and Western Europe makes the project politically untenable in the long term. The English will still be English, and the Germans will still be German, which, to return to our analogy, shows us that we are similar, yet uniquely different in our political struggles, as well as our forests. Those in the UK will have to tend to their Scots pines, and those in Germany to the black alder. However, this does not mean that common cause cannot lead to our current networks focusing on varying degrees of forest management between leaders, organizers, and even the simple adherent to these forms of conservation. The US, Germany, and the UK, despite our cultural and ethnic differences between the Anglo and the German, still face similar issues when it comes to an overbearing government, non-governmental, private, and individual entities on board with a more globalized, own nothing and be happy type of society in which history and identity have all been erased for some rainbow coalition. And all while this happens, we do know that despite our differences, we have these problems in common. Of course, the forests in question, areas in which they are unique and specific, are going to have, of course, some cross-pollination. Clearly, many dissidents in the West are Christian, and many are pagan and of other traditions. There will be overlap in our forest management of dealing with those who wish to set fire to our respective forests, but some situations may play out more like Rush's The Trees than perhaps something peaceful, and on the horizon I fear that may be coming. Which is why, once again, I advocate for this loose confederation model of proper ecological order among the like-minded first, and only broadly to interact with agreed-upon rules and methods to discuss terms for larger issues. Our epistemologies, theologies, a priori observations are all going to shape our reality and how to proceed. Clash is inevitable in these spaces, and one day that time will come for those clashes to happen. But right now, these loose, overlapping areas of agreement on the bigger issues of localization, self-sufficiency, self-improvement, and fighting against the forces of chaos, disorder, the demonic, what have you, is paramount for right now. The show forest will be different than the forests of Appalachia. The hickory will be different in the United States as it would be in Canada. This does not mean that we face similar struggles in our Western world. Deforestation, among many more, we certainly do. I cannot speak based upon my native land and tongue how the Hungarians should act. I am not intimately familiar with the situation on the ground. Yet I think all of us can learn a little bit of forest management from them as they stave off the worst like the rest of us, just as they can from any of our respective movements. Once more tonight, I'll walk into the dark and unknown woods, my mind filled with the echoes and the cultural imprint of Americans like Hawthorne, H.P. Lovecraft, and even Washington Irving. Perhaps the same one might walk into a forest of Germany thinking of Goethe and Schiller. We are who we are, and what works for one forest may set another ablaze. But what we can learn to help reforest and retain control from one another should flourish. Because if we fail to learn from proper methods of forest management, we may be arguing how to best set the hose, while our enemies have no problem turning on the gasoline and throwing matches in every which way but loose.